the house of God today. No other place that I would rather be. I tell you, it's been a really nice week. If the rain would kind of hold off just a little bit, it seems like it comes out of nowhere. We go for a couple days, we go for a couple weeks, and all of a sudden it rains straight for 2 days. But I'm not one to complain about those things, because one thing's for sure, regardless as to what happens throughout the day, regardless as to the circumstances that you might face, regardless of the weather, if you will, there are some things that will never change. And I can take a lot of peace in that fact, and I feel like that each and every person can as well. But upon considering this lesson, I feel like that this is something that I, for one, can identify with, not as someone who is on the side of a spectrum, because we're discussing parents as role models. So I'm not somebody that can speak from the side of a parent per se, but I can speak as a third-party individual, I feel like. Because I have had a lot of people who have imparted into my life, my parents included, but not only them, but also teachers and mentors that I've had throughout my life that have spoken into me. So I know what to expect out of role models. I've always been the type of kid that I wasn't necessarily happy unless I had somebody to look up to. And so after 23 years of this, I've kind of pieced together a little bit, I feel like, of what makes somebody a role model. But upon studying this, I realized that there's a lot of intricate ins and outs, if you will, to this whole concept that I feel like a lot of us can overlook. It's really easy to look past things for the simple fact that we don't think about it every day. We don't think about what our actions do to others every single day. We don't know how far-reaching those ripples will go, if you will allow me to say that. If you will let me use a bit of an analogy here, we could throw a rock in a pond. We don't know how far those ripples are going to go. We don't know what it's going to touch. We don't know what it's going to hit. And so it's really easy to kind of bury that, if you will, just from our day-to-day lives, especially considering the world we live in is very fast-paced, it's very busy. Everybody's always on it, constantly. And so it's easy to get caught up into this machine of just doing and doing and doing and doing and doing for you, and that's not a bad thing. But what we tend to forget is how what we're doing will affect somebody else. Right. That being said, how it will affect the people who are looking to us for guidance. And so, if you will, our lesson today, it's titled Parents as Role Models, but I want to add a little bit of a disclaimer here. Parents and people as role models. Parents and people as role models. If you will turn in your Bibles, or if you have the leaflet, you can use that as well. But our scripture is going to be taken out of the book of Luke, chapter 17. Book of Luke, chapter 17, starting in verse 26. And it says, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man. They did eat, they drank, they married wives, they were given in marriage until the day that Noah entered into the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them all. Likewise also, as it was in the days of Lot, they did eat, they drank, they bought, they sold, they planted, they builded. But the same day that Lot went out of Sodom, it rained fire and brimstone from heaven, and destroyed them all. Even thus shall it be in the day when the Son of Man is revealed. And that day he which shall be upon the housetop, and his stuff in the house, let him not come down to take it away. And he that is in the field, let him likewise not return back. Remember Lot's wife." Remember Lot's wife. If you will turn to the book of Psalms chapter 78. You will turn to Psalm 78, starting at verse 4. And it reads, "We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wondrous works that he hath done. For he established a testimony in Jacob and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children, that the generation to come might know them, even the children which should be born, who should arise and declare them to the children, that they might set their hope in God, and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and might not be as their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation set not their heart aright, and whose spirit was not steadfast with God. Amen. Brother Garrett, if you would read the focus verse, please.
By faith Noah being warned of God, things not seen yet, moved to fear, prepared his heart to save his house, by which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is faith. By faith.
All right, Brother Arms, if you would read the focus thought, please.
Examples show the seed of their parents' form, the moral character of future generations.
All right. So, parents and people as role models. This is something that when considered, it seems like it's pretty well common sense. That the role that we play in future generations is a very integral role. I've said it before of how knowledge is passed down and how it is transferred from person to person. That's not an accident. That's the way things were designed to be. We read it in the book of Psalms. This is the law. This is what God has set forth. This is what God has told you. Now, your responsibility is to tell it to the future generations. That is your sole responsibility. Otherwise, they say it this way, that truth can be lost in a generation's time. This is because if the generation prior to the one that exists now is to keep their mouth shut concerning the things of God, concerning any kind of fact whatsoever, then those ideas, those facts, those truths will be lost to the next generation. Why? Because nobody told them otherwise.
Right.
If nobody speaks about it, if nobody tells them about it, if they just ignore it and push it to the side, for whatever reason, if it's forgotten, if it's pushed under the table, then the generation that would come up would have no hope of ever attaining that knowledge. So, let me start out by saying this. Epistemology is the idea of how we acquire knowledge. It deals with how we know what we know and why we do. Now, that being said, this may follow a little bit of a different framework, but the same could be considered about a person's upbringing. There is an idea of epistemology that goes with that because it is transferring information from an older generation to a younger generation, from person to person. That is how you know what you know. Some things that we say we just learn by instinct, but the fact of the matter is if it wasn't for somebody as a baby getting in your face and talking to you and communicating with you, you would not know how to talk.
Right.
There are some things that are just picked up on like that. They need somebody to watch. They need somebody to follow direction from. So that being the case, this epistemology, that idea, sets in motion how we transfer this information from generation to generation, to our children, to our students, to anybody younger than us. That's just how it goes. It's a downward process, if you will. It flows from the highest generation, the oldest generation, downward. Think of it like open faucets, if you will. The water will just keep flowing until it's shut off.
That's right.
And so that's how generations acquire knowledge. That's how we acquire knowledge from the generation that came before us. So if you will allow me to use this term, generational epistemology, that's what I'm talking about right now. So we know and we act based on our raising and based on our upbringing, by our background. That dictates what we know and what we do.
Sure.
See, much of our knowledge and subconscious habits, the things that we just do that make up our character, all of it comes from this. It sets up a basis for how we view and how we react to the world around us day by day. The way that we think, the way that we pattern our lives, everything is set up based upon these foundational principles that have been passed down from generation to generation. Or how we view the world around us and how we react, maybe in a negative sense, from those aspects that were not passed down. You know, you can take this both ways. Now, there was a really interesting article that I want to share with you guys. I thought was great. The title of the article was "Please Do It Better," and it says this. It says a prominent newscaster told of a letter she received one day from a young fan. This little girl was only 8 years old, but she had already decided on her career. She wanted to be a newscaster and had her heart set on hearing the famous recipient of the letter. It goes on to say that her words present a striking lesson for each and every person that would read this letter. It says, "Dear Mrs. Jones," she began, "when I grow up, I'm going to do what you do. Please do it better." So the newscaster wrote that from that moment on, anytime that she was tempted to give anything less than her best, she remembered her little fan out there watching her. She was constantly reminded that what she did today was setting the pattern for what a young person might do tomorrow. So she always tried to do it better, so to speak. As parents, we are given that same sobering responsibility. Whoever looks up to you, whether you are a parent, whether you are, say, an uncle, whether you are a teacher, there are people, there are children that are looking up to you, and we are living before young mimics whose tomorrows will largely be a reflection of how we live in front of them today.
Right.
Whom they will become is greatly determined by what they have observed. If we show them love and gentleness, they will live out the same. If we show them harshness and criticism, they will pattern that instead. If they see consistency in living for God, they will be committed. If they see hypocrisy, they will be misled. They will be confused. And so that being said, I think that describes very well the kind of impact that we can have on a life younger than ours. And so we have to consider this and bring it into the context of the world and the society that we live in. You see, we live in a world that is very vastly concerned with influence. They are very over-opinionated, if you will, and the skewed lines, and there are blurred definitions. That's the kind of society that we live in, one that is very shaky, that is very uncertain, one that changes constantly. Ultimately, we live in a society where because someone simply thinks something, or because they have bought into something, regardless of whatever the circumstances, regardless of the approach, if it makes any sense or not, it doesn't really matter, it is immediately validated, simply because that's what they feel. Why? Because of what our society has elevated. What they have deemed important. Now this is key, because whatever it is that society has deemed important, it begins to create a shift in the way that people think. It begins to create a bit of a paradigm, if you will, of people who once thought one way, but are now shifting to another. Now, this is not always a good thing, because this is what causes societies to fall and to falter. This is also what can cause societies to be built up. So the idea here is that there must be some kind of filter to take the younger generation through to decide what is good and what is bad. And so what we are surrounded by from day to day in our society is what Francis Schaeffer, he puts it like this. He says that our society is one of personal peace and affluency. That's what he says. See, nothing matters so long as you have a clear and justified conscience. Nothing really matters so long as you feel good about it. Nothing really matters so long as you're okay with your life and you attain as much wealth and material possessions as possible. There was an old saying that used to go like this: whoever dies with the most toys wins. Whoever has the most material possessions when they put you in the ground is the one who comes out on top. But the fact of the matter is that no matter what you attain in this life, you're going to leave it behind.
Right.
So you can come out on top all you want, but as soon as they put you down, you are right back where you started from.
Right.
From the dust we were created, from the dust we shall return. Now you see, this approach to life, this kind of get everything that you can approach, it seems like a good idea on the surface. It really does. It seems like it would make sense to live comfortably, to live as comfortably as possible, get everything that you want, and then just sit back and enjoy the ride. So this really makes sense, especially when the only thing a person lives for is their bank account or their lack of responsibility. That's the issue. It's a lifestyle where insecure people need things to feel important. And they can't stand the idea of somebody else telling them what to do or how to live, so to speak, even if it's for their own good. This is the kind of society that's being pushed. And why is this? Because there is a need to feel not just important, but relevant, like they matter. See, They want to feel like they're a person. That's where the problem comes in. You see, we have to take this into consideration of what our society has lifted up and what is praised in society. And what is that? What is praised in society and what is praised in pop culture today? That is wealth, that is position, that is uniqueness, and that is skill. Those are the important things in our world now. And it's not that those are bad things. It's just that there are more important things than this. It doesn't matter what kind of title that you hold. It doesn't matter how much money you have in your bank account. It doesn't matter how many interesting things that you have, how many stories that you can tell. Every one of those things are just as temporal as you and I are.
That's right.
And so, those are the important things in our world now, and thusly they are all that people are invested in, because it's the only thing that people see anymore. The only thing that they're invested in is the wealth, it is the skill, it is the notoriety. That's what people want. They hunger for it. Because that's the only thing that is ever pushed to us. That's the only thing that we see about a person most of the time, is status. In other words, they want power, they want influence, and they want success, but they want it on their terms. They want to be remembered and accepted, but they want it by their conditions alone. And so ultimately, if you disagree with what they do, then forget about you, because it's their life anyway. You can't say anything to them. See, does any of this sound familiar to anybody here?
Yeah.
See, there are so many people who think this way so strongly that they, being a fairly large section of society, they deem disagreeing with them as politically incorrect. See, in the same venomous ideology, this concept that they're pushing, it is being forced and it is being pushed through pop culture. See, it's being pushed through our stars, through our athletes, through our authors, through our musicians, and many of our politicians. And make no mistake, this is not an accident. This is intentional.
Yeah.
And it is very strong driving force. It is an indoctrination of this and the next generation. That is what we're looking at. All in all, they have no problem usurping your role as a parent, as an aunt, as an uncle, as an older sibling, as any type of mentoring relationship.
That's right.
All for the sake of installing, if you will, this virus-like agenda into the next generation. And what is that virus? It is one that attacks things like morals, like foundational concepts such as the definition of marriage, like sanctity of life, the respect for your elders, even all the way down to how they treat members of the opposite gender, and on what foundation they should build their life for a better home later.
Yeah.
And it's not even, let's not even get started on how they blatantly and eager they are when they slander God or when they slander the church or any authority for that matter. Ladies and gentlemen, let me make one thing absolutely crystal clear. Hollywood is a preacher too, and its pulpit is entertainment.
That's right.
Yes.
Sir.
So let's look at it like this. I've used this example before. If I had a white dry erase board, and I set it right here, we'll say that that represents the mind and the heart of a child at birth. Each and every person that comes in contact with that child or with that board carries somewhat of a marker. As they walk by, they leave a swipe.
Good.
The longer that they stand there, the longer they can scribble on it. Eventually, it wouldn't take long for that whiteboard to no longer be white. And whatever is on that board is the only thing that you're going to see. This is how the mind of a child would work. Everyone leaves their mark on a child. Everyone leaves their impression on the younger generation. That's just how it's always been. When that mark is made, it cannot be removed. And it is those foundational moments, if you will, those ever important snippets of time where you can make the absolute difference in the life of somebody else. Especially somebody as sensitive and as pliable, if you will, as a child.
Yeah.
Because there's one thing about a blank slate. You can't call it good or bad. There's nothing there.
Right.
There's nothing there. There's no light reflecting off of it. The only thing that you see is exactly what it is.
Right.
A blank board waiting to be marked on.
Uh-huh.
So whatever comes in contact with that, that is the key thing. And this is what we're finding more and more of, is how big of an impression that those in the entertainment industry are really making on the children, especially musicians and actors. And why not? Let's keep it in mind here that they are the ones who are set up on a global pedestal for everyone else to behold. And it makes perfect sense for them to be idolized by younger generations who want to do what they do, who want to say what they say, who want to believe what they believe. You see, there is a serious power concerning influence, folks. And this is a world that wants in on the raising of a child just as much, if not more, than the parents. Because if you can shape the minds of the next generation, then you can shape the next generation's society.
Sure.
See, the church holds the same view as well. This is why we have things like Sunday school, the most influential place for our children. I can think back, sitting in Sunday school classes, that's where I learned the doctrine, that's where I gained the foundational principle of the things that I believe to this day. Was there things that needed to be built off of that? Absolutely. But the foundation was there.
Right.
Was sitting in Sunday school classes at 8, 9, and 10 years old.
Uh-huh.
So we have Sunday school classes. This is the same reason as why our districts have their sections go through the trouble of hosting youth rallies.
Yeah.
This is why we have things like Holiday Youth Convention and North American Youth Congress. It's for the sake of a positive and intentional influence in a negative, influential world.
Yeah.
That is the reason why we go to these events. That's the reason why we host these kind of things, is because that there has to be some type of counterculture going on in the lives of our young people. The apostolic movement as a whole, from the beginning, has been a counterculture movement. And I'm just not talking about what took place back at Azusa Street. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about what happened with the apostles in the book of Acts.
Right.
They were not accepted. They were against culture from the very beginning. So this is nothing new to us. This shouldn't be something of a surprise. But that being considered, there has to be some type of insertion, if you will, some type of injection somewhere along the line of God into the lives of people, of young people,
Sure.
who are taking in doses and doses and doses and doses of worldliness and carnal mindsets. There has to somewhere be somebody that will step into the gap.
Right.
And all of this is good. All of this needs to happen, and it should happen. But make no mistake, unless there are individuals who are willing to plug in personally
Oh, yeah.
and make an effort to impact the next generation, then there are children, our nieces, our nephews, our students, those that look to us and call us mentors, will stand in serious danger of becoming just another victim to our society and its agenda.
Right.
Because the stars of our society, those who are considered on the forefront, because that they are welcome in millions of homes daily through radio and through television and through internet, and they have no problem making a personal connection where you and I have failed to do so. And then what happens? Who has the real influence? Who's the one with the marker? Who's the one who makes their mark on the board as they walk by?
Uh-huh.
It certainly isn't us.
Right.
And there's an interesting thing that we have to consider here. And we've heard it over and over again from celebrities and from athletes that they're only people. And they're certainly not role models. We hear it time and time again that they make mistakes and people should not model their lives after them from the first.
Sure. Yeah.
That's just their job. They make this disclaimer to separate themselves from the responsibility of having a child maybe act like they do.
Uh-huh.
Because they know what they're doing is wrong. In fact, we now see some parents taking on the exact same excuse as well and considering their part as a role model to their child. They say, well, they shouldn't model their lives after me because I'm only human, I mess up. But here's where things get messy. Because regardless of who we are or in what relation we are to a child, we have absolutely no say in whether or not that we are role models. We have no say in that. Same goes for celebrities, for teachers, and for relatives. So let that sink in for a second. Because the fact of the matter is that it is up to the child, it is up to the student to define who is their role model, regardless of what we say.
Yeah.
And when they make that decision, they will pattern their lives after those very same people.
Right.
They will do what they do, they will say what they say, and they will believe what they believe.
Yeah.
They will emulate and they will mimic their actions and their words and their lifestyle and their attitude. So, A person has no choice as to whether or not there will be a role model. The only choice that is given is whether a person, regardless of status or position or relationship, the only decision is to whether or not they will be a good one or they will be a bad one.
Right.
Because someone, somewhere is looking up to you. You can count on that. And so when you walk by that white board and you make a mark, think about what mark that you're leaving. Because that will come forward. It may not be right now. It may not be next week. It may not be next month. But 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, that mark is still going to be there. And it's a mark that you left. Is it a good mark or is it a bad mark?
Right.
Is it something that's going to help them in the future or is it something that's going to set them back? Is it something that will draw them closer to God or push them away?
Right.
This is the gravity of what we're dealing with. See, there are many biblical examples of good and bad mentorship. Plenty of them. In fact, there was probably a whole plethora of examples that crossed your mind as soon as I said that to you.
Yeah.
In fact, I found that the Bible is full of examples of people who did well, people who did good. And people, on the other hand, who were absolutely terrible in their example of it. But moreover, I found just as many, if not more, examples of men and women who, despite their mistakes, had enough character to continue being the best example that they could for the little eyes that were watching.
Right, that's good.
One example we find of this is Abraham. In the book of Genesis. Genesis 17, starting at verse 16. Genesis 17 and 16. The scripture says, we'll be reading in verse 21. The scripture says, and I will bless her and give thee a son also of her. Yea, I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of peoples shall be. Then Abraham fell upon his face and laughed and said in his heart, shall a child be born unto him that is 100 years old? And shall Sarah that is 90 years old bear? Now I want you to pay attention. There's a change in Abraham's idea here. There's a change in his approach. Because he's just been told that the son that he's already got, that's not the child of promise. But that doesn't mean that he abandons his son. His prayer right here, that change of viewpoint, if you will, there was something that got a hold of Abraham. And he goes on and says, Abraham said unto God, oh, that Ishmael might live before thee. And God said, Sarah thy wife shall bear thee a son indeed, and thou shalt call his name Isaac. And I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his seed after him. Now pay attention to what God has to say to Abraham's prayer. This was a man of fervent prayer. This was a man who did business with God. God says to Abraham, and it says, as for Ishmael, I have heard thee. Behold, I have blessed him, and will make him fruitful, and will multiply him exceedingly. 12 princes shall he beget, and I will make him a great nation. But my covenant will I establish with Isaac, which Sarah shall bear unto thee at this set time in the next year. See, we know of all the unfavorable circumstances surrounding Ishmael and Hagar. We've been over that. We've been over that since Sunday school. It was a harsh and it was a sporadic decision that was made by Sarah and Abraham against the will of God for the sake of spurring along what God had already promised. But when it came time for Abraham to see Hagar and Ishmael off, sometime later on, God remembered that promise that he made to Abraham, that he made to a man who was praying for the sake of his son. And in the book of Genesis 21, starting in verse 10. Genesis 21, 10 through 13. It says this, wherefore she said unto Abraham, cast out this bondwoman and her son, for the son of this bondwoman shall not be heir with my son, even with Isaac. And the thing was grievous in Abraham's sight because of his son. And God said unto Abraham, let it not be grievous in thy sight because of the lad, and because of thy bondwoman, and that Sarah had said unto thee, hearken unto her voice, for in Isaac shall thy seed be called. Now listen to this. God remembered that promise. God remembered that conversation with Abraham. He says, and also of the son of the bondwoman will I make a nation, because he is thy seed.
Yeah.
Because you are his father. Because you got on your face and you prayed. I'm going to move on his behalf. You see, that's one thing that we must consider. Prayer is a powerful thing. Prayer is an exemplary thing. Not only does it cause some type of reaction in the heavens, but it also causes a type of reaction with the child that you may be dealing with or with your family members. Who knows? Maybe God might reach down and touch the situation. You see, considering all of this, considering Abraham and Ishmael, I have a hard time believing that there was any conflict between Ishmael and Isaac because of their father's consistency in his walk with God. See, Ishmael would have known of the promise that was made to Abraham and all about his father's relationship with the Creator. Ishmael would have known that. And so would Isaac, being the child of promise. He would have known just as well. And why do I think this? Because it wasn't just Isaac who buried Abraham at his death. Isaac wasn't the only one. In Genesis chapter 25, starting in verse 8. Genesis 25 and 8. It says, Then Abraham gave up the ghost and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and was gathered to his people. And his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cove of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, which is before Mamre. It wasn't just Isaac, the supposed favorite child, that buried his father. No, Ishmael came back and buried Abraham alongside of Isaac. Whatever confrontation was there, it wasn't between the two children. Because they had an understanding. They had an understanding of who their father was. But it was because of that walk with God that he was an example. Abraham was an example, not just to Isaac, but to Ishmael as well. Another example would be that of Jacob, otherwise known as Israel. He is often pegged for being guilty of favoritism. But what people seem to miss is that, yes, he did love Joseph, but he also loved his other children as well. See, Israel was a man who was involved with his family, a man that was concerned with what was going on. In Genesis 37, starting at 13, verse 13. Genesis 37 and 13. And it says, And Israel said unto Joseph, Do not thy brethren feed the flock in Shechem? Come, and I will send thee unto them. And he said to him, Here am I. And he said unto him, Go, I pray thee, see whether it be well with thy brethren and with thy flocks, and bring me word again. So he sent him out of the vale of Hebron, and he came to Shechem. Israel was a man that was concerned for the well-being of his family in its entirety. He was a man who was curious, who was involved with his sons. You see, if Israel's children ever had an example, it was their father's integrity in his relationship with God. Because Israel knew a thing or two about a lack of integrity. He knew a little something about what it was to not have that integrity in your heart. The truth is, for a good portion of his life, Israel was a disobedient, deceiving liar. Even his former name, Jacob, it was reflective of that. But his life was changed in a confrontation with the Almighty, where his name was changed to Israel. And he became the recipient of his grandfather Abraham's promise. His life was a testimony to his children. The fact that he had a confrontation, he had a run-in with God, and he was changed forever. Not just that he was a recipient of a promise, but because he knew that he had an example to show to his children. Another example of this was David, whose life was absolutely in shambles more often than not. And much of what he suffered was self-inflicted because of his mistakes. But he never stopped trusting God. Right. See, he wanted the things that God wanted. He was a man after God's own heart. He wouldn't deal with paganism. He wouldn't deal with idolatry. He may have made some mistakes, but if there was anything that could have been said of David, it's that he loved God.
Right.
The same idea is realized in his son Solomon sometime later. He was another man who made absolutely horrid mistakes. But one thing is for certain, he never forgot about the God his father served. And he never forgot about the God that he served. So the book of Ecclesiastes It's written by the preacher, and it is often attributed to Solomon. They say that he was in his old age when it was written, and he was reflecting back on his life and sharing his thoughts with those who wish to learn from his wisdom. He took this time to write of his viewpoints and of his mistakes. In Ecclesiastes chapter 1, starting in verse 1. Ecclesiastes 1 and 1. This is what he said. This is Solomon speaking. He says, the words of the preacher, the son of David, king of Jerusalem. Vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What profit hath a man of all his labor which he taketh under the sun? One generation passeth away, and another generation cometh, but the earth abideth forever. The sun also riseth, and the sun goeth down, and hasteth to his place where he arose. The sun goeth toward the south, and turneth about unto the north, and whirleth about continually. And the wind returned again according to the serpents. All the rivers run into the sea, yet the sea is not full. Unto the place from whence the rivers came, thither they return again. And things are full of labor, and men cannot utter it. The eye is not satisfied with seeing, nor the ear filled with hearing. The thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which done is that which shall be done. There is no new thing under the sun. Is there anything whereof it may be said, see, this is new, and hath been already of old time, which was before us? There is no remembrance of former things, neither shall there be any remembrance of things that are to come with those that shall come after. I, the preacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem. And I gave my heart to seek and search out by wisdom concerning all things that are done under heaven. The sore travail hath God given to the sons of men to be exercised therewith. I have seen all the works that are done under the sun, and behold, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. When he speaks of life under the sun, when he speaks of this concept, he is speaking of life lived outside of the hand and of the authority of God, which he says is nothing more than vanity and vexation of spirit. That's the only thing you have to look forward to when you step out of the confines of the authority of God. Solomon knew this by experience. There was no fulfillment.
That's right.
There was no hope.
That's right.
No matter how much money he had, no matter how many wives, no matter how many diplomatic solutions he came up with so many other countries, him being in a position of authority, all is vanity and vexation of spirit. That's all it was. But what is Solomon's conclusion? In his old age, what is Solomon's conclusion? We can find that in Ecclesiastes chapter 12. We skipped around a little bit. Ecclesiastes 12, starting in verse 1. It says this, remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. He goes on to say in verse 8, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity. And then, right before he closes the book, he says this in verse 13, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. He says, I've given you an example of my life. I've given you an example of things that I've gone through, of what other people have gone through, of things that you will face in your life. Now, what is the conclusion of the whole matter? Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. Regardless of whatever position I felt like I had. He's saying to these people that are learning from him, regardless of whatever position I felt like I had, no matter what money I felt like I accumulated, the whole duty of man was to fear God and keep His commandments. Everything else is vanity and vexation of spirit. He says again, for God shall bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or whether it be evil. So this is spoken from a very deep foundation that he knew as a child and as a young man, that was instilled in him by the example of his father David. This was coming from a place of conversations that he may have had with his father concerning the conversations that David had had with God himself and the experiences that he had with God. And it's late in his life that Solomon realizes that everything that I have accumulated is nothing. But I remember conversations with my father. I remember what it felt like. I remember what it was like being close to God. And the only thing that I can say is everything that I have built myself up for, aside from that, is vanity and vexation of spirit. It has harmed me. It has caused me nothing but trouble because I lost focus on the main thing. And what gave that definition to Solomon? It was the life that David lived.
Yeah.
It was an impression made on Solomon that David had put there.
Right.
When Solomon was nothing more than a whiteboard, David walked by with that marker and made a clean swoop across. And that stayed with him for the rest of his life. And it dictated to him later in his life what was important. But just as there are instances of good influences, of things that turn out right, there are also ones that don't turn out so well at all. In the book of 1 Samuel, we read of a subpar priest by the name of Eli, who had 2 sons named Hophni and Phinehas. The family's downfall was prophesied, and yet the 2 sons were still arrogant and highly disobedient, certainly not becoming a priest. But what other example was it that they had aside from their father? See, ultimately, their father's habit of disregarding the things of God or kicking at the offerings of God, as 1 Samuel 2:29 puts it, it led to their deaths. You can read it in 1 Samuel chapter 4, verses 4 through 11. Here they are, these priests. They say it's time for war, Hophni and Phinehas. But they don't understand the gravity of the things that they're dealing with. And so, as they've done before, they picked up the ark of God, which was a representation of the Spirit of God, and they walked out into the battlefield, fully expecting to walk out victorious.
Sure.
But they were only going through the motions. You see, they didn't quite wrap their heads around the fact that they were carrying the Spirit of God into the battlefield, and that's what allowed them to take the victory. The only thing they were concerned about was the God box.
Yeah.
The only thing that they were concerned about was this relic that their father had talked to them about, that had so much history behind it, that when they carried it out to battle, they never lost.
Yeah.
But this time, because of their attitude, because of their approach that was passed down to them from a prior generation, they walked out onto that battlefield and they were killed there on the spot. And Israel was taken. One chance.
Yeah.
One chance to make it right. And because of a lapse in judgment, because somebody did not talk to them about the importance of the things of God, one misstep led to their deaths and the deaths of their entire force.
Right.
That being said, they took for granted the things that were sacred, and they handled it with a sinful approach. You can read into the life that Hophni and Phinehas lived. It was terrible. But because that they felt like they were entitled to something, they stepped forward anyway. And it was ultimately because of a terrible example from a father. And they ignored the gravity of the situation, and they treated the Ark of the Covenant with disrespect.
Right.
But in conclusion, if you will turn your Bibles to Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs 22, starting in verse 6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart. You see, I say all of that to say this. There is one thing that we have to bear in mind, one thing that we have to consider. There are members of an up-and-coming generation that are looking to you and I as role models, as people to look up to. They will say what you say.
Yeah.
They will do what you do. They will believe what you believe.
Right.
Why? Because you are the example. You are the teacher. You are the mentor. The younger generation is not looking for a way to be self-sufficient.
Right.
The younger generation is looking for somebody that will teach them what it means to be self-sufficient.
Oh, yes.
They're not looking for an autonomous kind of lifestyle, something to do from their own, especially not young ones. The fact of the matter is this, is that they are looking to you and I to step into the gap, to lead and to guide, to be moved by the Holy Spirit, to impart into them wisdom, the things of God.
Yes.
As we had talked about Solomon earlier. Yes, David made his mistakes. Yes, David did terrible things, but the fact remained that David still spoke of God to Solomon. He was still an example to his son. And that affected him later down the road, after he had already made his mistakes. After he had already found himself in a tight spot. What did he fall back on? He fell back on the knowledge that was passed down to him from his father David about the God that he served. That's what he fell back on. He looked through all the other markings that society had left on that whiteboard and he said, I remember that one. He said, that one was the one that my father David left me. That one was the legacy that he left me because he took the time to impart into me experiences that he had had. About knowledge that he knew. And that's what it takes. It's going to take a generation willing to stand up and take the next generation by the hand and lead them to where they need to go. Because without it, who's going to be their teacher? Who's going to be their preacher? We can't leave it up to society. We can't leave it up to Hollywood. Because the things that they're preaching, the things that they're teaching, they're not the things that are wholesome to a society. The fact remains is this, is that there is a future generation, an important generation, the generation called by God, that we have the responsibility to minister. Just as the generation before us ministered to us and taught us and led us. Why don't we carry that generational epistemology forward? Why don't we continue teaching them and leading them and guiding them so that maybe they'll understand when it's time for them to pass the torch, that they can do it with courage,